welcome to our Coproduce Care chat. My name's Sophie Chester-Glynn and I am director at Coproduce Care. And just a bit of an introduction for anybody who doesn't know us, doesn't know who we are. We started about, at the end of last year, and we're a non-profit organisation. And in another life, I am also a care provider for social care services in the Southwest. But I was really frustrated about the fact that there wasn't enough airtime around the issues of social care, what we do, celebrating what we do, understanding the complexities of it. So that's why I thought it'd be a great idea to create Coproduce Care, which would do a number of things, such as helping people to influence social care policy and law, and also give people a platform to talk about social care. So on the influencing policy side, we have something we're doing at the moment, which is responding to a consultation to the Health and Social Care Select Committee, which I will talk about shortly. And then on the side of opening up the care debate, we are doing things like live streams. And they weren't live streams, they were videos before. And when we went into lockdown, we went from face-to-face videos and uploading those on YouTube to live streams, which is what we're doing now. So welcome. I'm hoping that if you're watching, that you are liking our page, if you're on Facebook, and of course, if you are on YouTube, you are pressing subscribe if you haven't already, and you're clicking the bell to make sure that you know when we've got videos coming out. And this today is a busy day. We've got some fantastic speakers today. I don't expect you to stay with us all day, but right now we're going to be talking to Toby Lowe. I've been a big fan of Toby since I watched a YouTube of him the end of last year. I got in touch and I said, more people need to hear what you have to say about complex systems, about commissioning, about a new way of being human. I mean, it just spoke to me in so many different ways. So we're going to speak to Toby today. Later on this evening, we're going to be speaking with the CEO of Care England, which is a Care Providers Association, and that's Martin Green. Now, you might be familiar with him because he's been on the news a lot talking about the issues of care homes specifically in this time of COVID-19. So he is a massive champion for getting better recognition of the sector and support. So he'll have a lot to say tonight. So again, if you subscribe, if you click on the bell, you won't have to do anything. You'll just know when we go live with our interview with him at 7 o'clock this evening. Similarly, after him, we'll be talking to the CEO, the new CEO of Skills for Care, Una Smith. Now, I think this is her first real proper live interview, so it's a pretty big deal. We're really looking forward to talking to her. And of course, if you know Skills for Care, that's the support organisation for registered managers within social care. So thinking about the support that they're getting now, well-being, training, there's a lot we've got to get through with her as well. So that's all coming up later on this evening. But for now, this is going to be a great conversation. We want to make it dynamic. We're going to ask Toby to introduce us to his research and his findings and things that he's doing now. And then after that, we're going to go into a bit more of a conversation. So if you want to chat, if you have questions, just put them up on the comments box. And also, if you want to share it, just get more people coming in and listening and finding out what he has to say, then share it. If you're on Twitter, then put some comments on hashtag chat for care. These are the chats that we're doing, the live streams. That's our hashtag, and get people interested and joining in the debate, so it's not just a lecture. And also, I hope you can hear me okay. I hope you can see me okay. My internet does go a bit dodgy sometimes, so just again, give a shout out if that's not so clear for you. So before I go into properly getting Toby in, I just want to show a very short clip of one of the videos, which is there's a few on YouTube anyway, and then we'll go into talking to Toby.
I think you have a public management problem. We have a public management problem. In that local area coordination, as I've heard this morning, is about love. It's about human relationships, right? And your current public management mechanisms asks you to metricize love. It asks you to prove the value of human beings having relationships to one another. Now, if your management method is asking you to prove the value of human beings having relationships with each other, the problem is with the management method, not with your work. So, what I'm going to talk to you about.
Okay, so that's a bit of a snippet, and it seems out of context. You're like, what's this all about? Well, we're going to introduce Toby to talk to us about this. Hello, Toby, and welcome to Coproduce Care Chat.
Thanks very much. Always terrifying to watch yourself back on presenting on YouTube. Thanks for that.
I know, and I love the way I never told you which clip I was going to show as well. So totally out of context and just like random. But I thought I'd change it up. And of course, you were talking at the local area coordination network conference, and that was last year. So again, it's slightly different, but I think if people who are in commissioning might ring a bell. And of course, you're author and visiting professor in public management at the Centre for Public Impact. And I've also been looking at some of the work you've been doing. There's a series of reports that you've done, including one about exploring the new world, practical insights for funding, commissioning, and managing in complexity. And the whole idea of individuals and systems and communities being extremely complex, and how we sort of deal with that in our management speak within commissioning generally. And of course, the famous human learning systems. So I know you want to talk through this a little bit. So should we go straight into the presentation?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, let's do that. Great. Okay, so I will come out and let you go for it. So slide 1.
There we go. So I thought I would just give kind of a little 5-minute overview of where I'm coming from with this, so that everyone can be up to speed with our conversation. So our starting point for all this is that we need to acknowledge that the world is complex, and particularly that the outcomes that social care is looking for are created by the complex systems that exist in the world. And too often previously, we have pretended that the world is simple and linear in order to try and make the process of managing outcomes easier. But it's our assertion that if we fail to understand and embrace complexity, we won't be able to create the outcomes that we seek. And so move to the next slide, please, Sophie. And to cut a long story short, we accept that the world is complex. So the world is made up of hundreds or thousands of interdependent factors all working together to produce an outcome, that those factors are constantly in movement and constantly changing, then that description of complexity places a requirement on us to do things differently. And what it demands is that, firstly, we respond to variety. We understand that each person's strengths and needs are different. So if we want to create positive outcomes for each person, we need to be able to respond appropriately and differently to each person's strengths and needs. Secondly, it means that the activities we do, the interventions, the services we offer need to adapt to change, because the context in which those interventions are working and are undertaken constantly changes. So how we do those needs to constantly adapt to that change. And finally, because outcomes are created by the complex systems that is the world, all of our lives interacting together, it means that if we want to make those systems work better, we need to understand that our leadership shape systems whose behavior we can't predict and which no one controls. And so this is the background to us saying that we need to do public management differently, because our current way of doing public management, of setting targets, of monitoring against those, and blah, 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 cannot deal effectively with the reality, the complex reality of the world. Move on. And so we've been working with a whole number of public and voluntary sector organisations to think, how can we do this differently? And through a kind of long and winding path, we've got to a place where we can articulate some of those ideas as a new approach to public management, which we call human learning systems. And you can see much more about it at the new website we launched just a couple of weeks ago, humanlearning.systems. And I'll dig into each of those kind of ideas in turn. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the key ideas of the human learning systems approach is that the human means a reframing of the purpose of public service. So the purpose of public service is simply and only about meeting human strengths and needs. And the learning element says that the focus of management, of public management, changes, so that the focus of management in this new approach is creating the conditions for learning and adaptation, not about trying to control the performance of people or organisations. And finally, the leadership focus changes, and the focus of leadership at all levels in the service is to nurture the healthy systems that create. So those are the three kind of core ideas in the learning systems approach. Move on, please. And just to focus down on one of those, this idea of learning, that learning becomes the focus for management, because in a complex environment, learning is necessarily a continuous process. So in a complex environment, there is no such thing as a simple idea of what works at a program level. So commissioners, it is impossible for commissioners to purchase an evidence-backed package that will be what works in a particular context. Because in a complex environment, what works is always changing. And so what works is the continuous process of learning and adaptation. So in order for funders and commissioners to enable what works to happen continuously in a complex environment, what funders and commissioners are doing is switching from purchasing pre-packaged products of care to purchasing the capacity for organisations to learn and adapt. Move on, please. And just to kind of quickly highlight the implications of all of this for how we do public management differently. And these are implications that are being worked through in practice. So this isn't theory, this is what organisations who are doing this are doing differently. Firstly, they don't use targets, because targets, I mean, and the evidence on this is really clear. Targets prevent flexible, bespoke responses, and they make work less efficient, so don't use them. Secondly, the organisations working this way build trust. So they build trust between actors in the system, and it is the job of leaders to create systems where people trust each other. So you can't assume trust between people, you need to work on the relationships. Thirdly, organisations learn together, they co-produce, they experiment, and they talk together about what doesn't work. Fourthly, to enable a system to be healthy, for a system to work where the actors in that system cooperate and collaborate effectively, one of the crucial conditions is that everyone's voice is important. So leaders in healthy systems work to make sure that everybody is heard. And finally, to make this new approach to public management work, building new forms of accountability and responsibility. They are creating, in particular, forms of mutual accountability where peers hold each other to account, and where citizens and people sharp end of service are able to be in a kind of shared accountability relationship with those who serve them. And they're also nurturing personal responsibility. They're nurturing in each person who worked in that system intrinsic motivation to do their job well. Because that can be nurtured by effectively. And so hopefully that gives a little sense, a flavour of what it is that we're talking about for all your listeners and viewers.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. There's so much to go into, I think, in all of that. And we've had a few comments, which has been really helpful. I want to just scale back a little bit and ask you, I know you worked in as quite high up in public services. What made you feel that the way that they were being run just wasn't fit for the service that you were trying to provide, for the people that you were trying to provide services for? Because this for you wasn't, you're not a traditional, I mean, is there ever a traditional academic, but you're not somebody who went, you know, from university and had a specialism and then stayed in it and did research. You were very much coming from the basis of, I've been there, I've worked in it, and I've known it's not right, and I actually want to dig into this. So for people who kind of don't know your journey, if you could just tell us, you know, where you started from that side and how you got into it, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. So I worked for 15 years in the public and voluntary sector, and I think I actually remember almost the exact moment where something in my head went snap and went, this cannot be right. So I used to be chief executive of a charity in the northeast of England, serving some of the most kind of vulnerable and disadvantaged people there. And we, one of the programs we were involved with was a youth justice program, where we had a partnership with the council to provide kind of positive youth provision for kids who were in the criminal justice system, who were before a young offenders institution type program. And we had a partnership with them for I think it was 10 years in total. In about year 7 or 8 of this partnership, the council experimented with the outcomes-based accountability approach. So they moved to a system whereby they wanted to hold all of their managers and all of their providers accountable for producing particular outcomes. And so this filtered down through to this youth justice program that we were working on. And the way that it worked was that the manager of the youth justice service, he would give us, an organisation, £30,000 a year, and we would provide 4 hours a week of kind of positive activities as part of a 20-hour-a-week youth justice program that these kids were on. And we were talking about next year's provision in a kind of planning session. The master manager said to me, he said, if you want your £30,000 next year, Toby, you're going to have to claim that you prevent these kids from reoffending, because that's the outcome that we're being held accountable for now, for our service. And I said to him, but you know that I can't legitimately make that claim, because we only provide 4 hours of activity out of the 20 hours a week these kids are having. And we do it all in partnership with your youth workers, and let alone all the other experiences that are going on in these kids' lives that affect whether they reoffend or not. So we cannot truthfully claim that we would prevent these kids from reoffending. And he said to me, yeah, I know that. I know that wouldn't be true. That's why I need you to write on this form. I said, so you need... I'm
just going to interrupt you slightly, because it's a little bit of sound on yours. So I don't know whether you need to take the headphones out or swap them or try, because I love this story. And I basically, for anyone who didn't quite hear it, the gist, while you're kind of like fiddling with headphones. Yeah, no, carry on with that. It's the idea of outcomes and how Toby is speaking to his boss and is saying, you know, I need you to show me that you have achieved this pretty incredible outcome. Just you in your organization. So this is what his boss is telling him he needs to prove and show and evidence before he gets the next tranche of money to carry on doing what they're doing.
Is that any better, Sophie?
We'll see. Yeah, it just dips it in and out very, very slightly. It's subtle, but I'm hearing it, so maybe other people are too. So yeah, let's go again.
So this commissioner is basically saying to me, if you want your £30,000 next year, you need to claim that you produce this outcome of these kids not reoffending. I say to him, do you know that that's not a truthful claim, because we do all this in partnership and there are many other influences. He said, I know that's not true, but that's what I need you to write on this form. So I said to him, you want me to lie to you on your forms? Yes, he says, that's exactly what I need you to do. And it was at that point that something in my head went snap, because I suddenly had this vision of all of that data getting sucked up from the forms that I was filling in and the forms of my kind of counterparts from across the voluntary sector in the city. And you could see them getting sucked up into a data dashboard that the council kind of senior staff would be looking at and would be looking at and thinking, excellent, we're doing a fantastic job here. All is right with the world. But none of that data was true, because that outcomes-based accountability scenario created an environment in which people stopped telling the truth to each other, systematically stopped telling the truth to each other. The way that system worked was based on people lying to each other through the paperwork. And I thought, we must be able to do better than this, because if people are systematically lying to each other through the paperwork, how can any of this get any better?
Yeah. I mean, so that's one of the things that really run true to me, because I know within social care, there was a lot of talk, and there still is, like, outcomes-based commissioning is one of the buzzwords. I remember sitting in a meeting once and they said, what we're going to do is we're going to change commissioning so that, care providers were going to pay you a certain rate, but then you can get a top up if you reach certain outcomes. And on the basis of it, that sounds pretty sensible. Yeah, you achieve something, you get paid for it. But because we're people dealing with people, and the support we're giving is not really just on, an outcome might be, for example, supporting someone to get a job, but that's not really just down to us. We have to be in the right area. We have to support the right person who actually wants to get a job, and also the whole complexities around what they're dealing with. So that really spoke to me, the idea that we could just focus on something that seemed a little bit too simplistic.
And this is where I started doing my research. So through that, something going snap in my head, through a kind of long story short, I ended up as a visiting fellow at Newcastle University Business School, because they said, why don't you come and do some research about outcomes-based performance management? So I did. And the kind of shocking thing I discovered is that there's a whole ton of evidence about what happens when people implement outcome-based performance management, so outcome-based commissioning, all that kind of stuff, and it all says the same thing: that outcome-based performance management creates gaming, creates that systematic lying, and so it's actually not funny how clear the evidence is about that. So this is why we set off trying to do something different, because whenever outcome-based performance management is instituted, it necessarily creates the drivers for gaming. So that's what our research was able to demonstrate. And once you get there, you kind of and you come from that world where it's your job to make things a bit better, right? And so that gave us a job of, what does the alternative look like? So essentially, the stuff that I was describing before, the kind of human learning systems approach, is our last 5 and a bit years of work on, okay, we know that outcome-based performance management doesn't work and can't be made to work. So what else can we do? So all that I presented before was our attempt to work with different people and organizations to answer the question, okay, what else can we do?
Great. So you broke it up into the human and the learning and the system side of it. And that's sort of came up from your almost like a grounded approach where it came up from your research, from what you were doing. And it's quite strong when you talked, the video that I showed at the beginning about love, and nobody talks about love and commissioning. That doesn't sound right, because when you think about commissioning, you think about there's a way that people are taught, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's something like a management term that people are taught to do, which is treating them like with the outcomes based commissioning, for example, but the human side. So talk to us a bit about how that came about, or any examples of why you thought this is where we need to go.
And so this as a whole approach to doing things differently, as an approach to doing public management differently, it has to start from doing the right thing by the people who are being served. So this is like the kind of reconnecting with the ethical purpose of public service, right? The ethical purpose of public service is, excuse me, to help people live the lives they would want to lead, right? Public service is our shared commitment to one another to help each other out when times are tough. And so creating a more effective approach to public service management needs to start by asking the question, what does it take to require, what management approaches are required in order to do the job well? And the job starts with a set of human interactions and human relationships. A citizen, a person being served, and a person who is trying to help them, right? And so getting that relationship right and understanding the full humanity of both the person being served and the person who is serving them, that is crucial to getting that work right. There's a really amazing example of this from Gateshead, where they've been working on kind of how to do public service differently, and like trying to move to an idea that public service is bespoke by default. So each and every citizen gets their particular and unique strengths and needs catered for. And they started this out. They started an experiment with this in their work with council tax debt. So previously, their approach to council tax debt had been like almost every other council in the country. If you fail to pay your council tax, it raises a little flag on their system, and they say, and they send you a letter saying, "Oh, we see you haven't paid your council tax. Please get in touch to talk about a payment plan," which nobody does. And then a few months go past, and if people still haven't paid, they send out another letter saying, you still haven't paid your council tax. This is really serious. If you don't pay your council tax, we'll take you to court. And at this point, because they've issued some kind of threat, people, like a fair few people, used to get in touch, and they would arrange a payment plan that by and large they wouldn't stick to, because they were in a whole bunch of debt and a whole bunch of other things going on in their lives. And eventually this process will wind up with the bailiffs going round, knocking on people's doors, taking away, like trying to recover that debt by force. But that frequently didn't work, because these were people who had almost nothing in their lives that could be taken. And so the council was creating a system for council tax debt that made vulnerable people's lives work and didn't really reclaim very much money. So no one benefited at all. So they decided to experiment with doing something differently. So they said, what would happen if we took council tax debt as a signal that someone might need some help in their life? So when someone got into council tax debt, for a cohort of people, instead of sending them a threatening letter saying, what they did was someone from the council got in touch and went, "We see you're in some council tax debt. Let's put that to a side for a minute. Could you just tell us what's going on in your life? Like, do you need any help?" And from that,
and from the relationship that those workers built with the people, they found out what was actually happening in people's lives. So, for example, there was an example of one case where the person had got into council tax debt because their neighbour was being a bit threatening and aggressive, which meant that the person had to give up one of their two jobs, because to do their evening job required her mother to come and babysit her son, and her mother wouldn't come round anymore because she was scared of the neighbour. But the council wouldn't rehome her, because as soon as you get into council tax debt, the council policy was, "Oh, we will punish you. You're not allowed to move. We won't offer you a new house." So she was trapped in this place because she'd got into council tax debt. But in order to get out of council tax debt, she needed to move, but the council wouldn't allow. So the workers in the situation saw the craziness of that as a policy and went, "Okay, let's just ignore that. Let's tear that rule up for this person. Let's experiment with doing something differently." So they were able to move her in a place where nearer to her son's school. So everything about that life got easier. They phoned up her work and said, "Would you take this woman back, because she's now able to work?" The employer was like, in a heartbeat. She was amazing. So she got her job back. She was able to pay her council tax back. Educational outcomes and school improvement, attendance improved, but everything got better, because simply the council had switched to, rather than sending you a threatening letter, let's form a relationship with you and see what it is that you need.
That's really powerful. And I think when it just explains a little bit about the complexity of people's lives and how actually it's really difficult for us to do anything effectively if we just look at one part of a system. And in fact, we need to look into why people are behaving the way they are behaving, or not responding to what they should do or what everybody else is doing in a certain situation. And then that comes on to, what do we do in those situations? Do we say, okay, that person was really lucky because they had a team that realized they needed to look into their situation? Or do we then say, well, can we just extrapolate this way of working to the rest of how we do things? And that then I presume would go into, okay, the learning part. We're seeing this doesn't work. The system is not right. Then we need to learn. So, I mean, I don't know if that situation, there was examples of learning, or you're seeing it in other organizations you work with.
Exactly, because what Gateshead were doing in that context was treating that as an experiment. What can this tell us? If we experiment with working in this way, what does that tell us about how we can do public service in other contexts? And so, but they specifically ran that as an experiment. So they kept detailed case notes for each of the cohort of citizens that they were serving. They kept notes of every single interaction that they had with each of those people. And so they were able to compare the types of interactions and interventions that team were able to do with the ways in which both those people had been served previously by the system, mostly not served by the system, and also how kind of similar people elsewhere in the system were being served. And through those kind of processes, we're able to see that seemed to be a better way of working, and we're able to create some principles for that, which they're now seeking to explore elsewhere. And what we're trying to learn from that is, we've tried to capture that element of it in the kind of human bit of the kind of human learning systems, and say, if public service has a relentless focus on building relationships with people so that they can each have their individual strengths and needs attended to in whatever way is appropriate, then that is the kind of necessary starting point for public service. And the point about learning is, it's not a one-off stage in a public service process. You can't find out what the right thing to do is and then do more of it. Everyone needs to be learning all the time, because
that each person's needs are different, so that the workers need to treat each case as a learning opportunity, and they change over time. So if that woman, the case that I was talking about, needs more support in 2 years' time, what the intervention that was made for her back then won't be the right thing to do this time around. They'll need to learn all over again because context changes.
Thank you for that. And in terms of the systems, we've talked a lot about the systems, and that is a perfect example of how there are so many things that are involved in everybody's lives. Is that the Plymouth example? Because you talk about, that's the Plymouth example? That's brilliant. Are you seeing, because I know that you have talked about now people are reaching out to you saying, actually, I think, I like what you have to say, and I think we need to explore this. And you're keeping track of what they're doing. I think maybe you have a researcher in some of what they're doing. Are you seeing this working, or is it just too early to tell?
So the Plymouth example is a really nice one, because they are kind of, in some respects, furthest down the track of doing this as an alternative approach to public management systematically. So what they've done is create a systems response to supporting vulnerable adults in Plymouth. So they asked, how can organisations who support kind of people who've experienced homelessness, mental health problems, substance misuse, those kind of that kind of cocktail of challenges that go on in people's lives, how can organisations work together more effectively to provide a properly joined up response that that meets the particular needs of each and every person? So they decided to commission differently. I mean, they did kind of 4 years of systems development, system leadership work, building trust and relationships between the different people in the different organizations. And that meant, doing that work meant that they could commission differently. So they did they did a joint commission between the council and the CCG, £80 million 10-year commission for a system of support, of care for vulnerable adults. No targets, no KPIs, just £80 million public money based on the principle that the organisations would work together, would collaborate together and learn together. And what they've seen through that process is that, for example, when COVID came along, because those organisations weren't working to predefine targets set before COVID, they could all instantly change what they were doing and adapt to the COVID environment, because they didn't have any targets telling them to do anything else. So they didn't have to waste time asking, can we suspend those targets that aren't relevant anymore because this thing that we hadn't seen coming has happened. The whole system was set up to deal with the unexpected, because it's set up to respond to complexity. So they were able to house all of their street homeless people in 6 days when COVID came along, and did so in a way that didn't rely on kind of unsuitable accommodation, like putting people in hotels that then a bunch of people get kind of kicked out of, because there are some people who are street homeless who can't, for whom being in a hotel, it just isn't the right environment. And they also, like, even before kind of COVID came along, they were starting to see massive savings in the system, because it turns out that doing the right thing by people and helping people address people's needs first time is a massively cheaper way of doing things. So, for example, they used to spend £1.2 million a year on emergency bed and breakfast accommodation for homeless families. And when they looked at that, a significant amount of that cost came because the housing officers were previously evicting people. They saw it as their job to prevent, to kind of challenge antisocial behaviour amongst tenants. And if people were doing antisocial behaviour, they evicted them. And because the
the homelessness support budget was different to the housing support budget. It meant that the extra homelessness support for the families they evicted wasn't their problem. I'm going to evict you because that has no consequences for me. By combining all of that into one systems response, all of a sudden the housing officer's budget and the homelessness support budget are the same budget. And one of the consequences of that is that rather than evict families that were causing trouble, what they did was do a program of support for families that enabled them to keep in their homes and kind of deal actually with the problems that were leading to the antisocial behaviour. And that meant that Plymouth reduced, in 6 months, it reduced its projected budget for emergency bed and breakfast accommodation from £1.2 million to £600,000. So they were on track to make a 50% saving in emergency accommodation.
That is just incredible. And I'm so glad I asked for that example now, because now coming back into the care arena, that just brings images of the discussions which I've always known about because I work in it, but now everybody gets the gist of, is that disparity between health and social care, and then housing, and then everything else. So you've got, when we're coming now to the system side of it, you're separating people, so professionals, from talking to each other because they're in, that's that department that deals in that part of the local authority. And then you've got the CC clinical commissioning groups who can commission their way. And then you've got, housing, which will have its own council and its own department and everything else. And if you go back to the basic side of being human, in your examples, people are probably picking up the phone and say, because they won't know how the other systems work. I mean, that's one of the things that I found from either doing these talks or just talking with health people a bit more, because we're having to respond to COVID. They just don't get at all how social care works, just as well, as much as I won't know how their departments work. But the very basics that I think, well, obviously this is going to be a problem, whether we're talking about PPE or infection control, whatever, it hasn't even occurred to them. And especially people within public health, certain obvious things just don't occur to them because the systems have never talked to each other. They've never seen a person and then worked that outwards. They've just seen how we work in our silos. So practically from those examples, I can see in my mind how it's so important to think differently.
Exactly, and that the systems perspective isn't simple or easy to do by any stretch of the imagination, right? And there is no such thing as a kind of perfect system. The important thing that we've seen is a group of people thinking about a system from the perspective of the people being served. Because you can think about systems in any way, and like any system that you care to identify is a construct. It's a perspective on the world. So drawing a particular boundary around a system, that's just a set of choices that people make. The important step seems to be, let's draw our boundaries of what we think of as a system that we can work on and in from the perspective of the person being served. And if we make that choice about how to understand our system, then it forces us to think about how those actors collaborate in different ways. Because let's set up our mechanisms for collaboration, our information systems, the meetings that we have, the blah, 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 like the bits and pieces of how collaboration actually functions. Let's set those collaborations up to enable us to serve that person better.
Which seems a little bit like a no-brainer, but we're not doing it. We make things overly complex, I think. But a lot of people might think, well, yeah, it seems really simple, but there are umpteen million people within this country, who have very different perspectives. How are you supposed to do this management side of the public, which is a very disparate, nuanced group, from the perspective of each individual?
Indeed, and this is the
the point about complexity and variety, right? We're all different. There are as many ways to be human as there are human beings, right? And if your management paradigm, if your management way of thinking is about control, then it's impossible for you to respond to everyone's needs, because as a manager, you're thinking, how can I control the response that each and every person gets to make sure that they're getting the thing that I think that they need? That's impossible. It is impossible for someone doing that management role to make sure that each and every person gets what they need. That control mindset, which is kind of what has dominated our management thinking, that's the thing that gets in the way. So what we do in the kind of human learning systems approach is flip that and say, the only people who have enough understanding about what should happen for a public service interaction between worker and the person they're being served, the only people who have enough knowledge to say, do this and don't do that, are the person being served and the worker who has a strong enough relationship with them to really understand them. Only people who know. So what that means is that the job of management is to set up the autonomy, the power, the resource allocation, so that the relationship between the citizen and the worker serving them, there is decision-making power and authority there, so that each person gets what they need. And it is the job of managers and leaders at all levels to enable that to work well.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is co-production. I think that's the buzzword. It's difficult because it's actually more of a mindset.
So co-production, yes. Yes, co-production. This is a yes and.
Okay.
So, because co-production can, from our perspective, and this would just be from our perspective, can be used well or badly. So if co-production involves, let's bring in a group of service users and help them design our standardized service that then everybody gets. So we want to increase the range of voices that we bring in to designing our standardized service. Then that is co-production, but it won't really help, because just because you brought these range of people in to design your standardized service that everyone gets, it won't meet the needs of the people who weren't in that room. So the process of co-production shouldn't be, let's bring service users in for a consultation to help us design this strategy that then comes down, we enforce down on the workers that everyone gets. The process of co-production should be a live thing in the relationship between the worker and the person being served. That's where the co-production should take place. So people shouldn't have to take part in consultations to get what they need. If this alternative way of working that we're talking about, people get what they need because of their relationship with their worker. Each and every live context is a co-production context.
That's really interesting, because then, I think we could go into a whole conversation about co-production, but absolutely. And I think when people use the word co-production, they sometimes don't, from the conversations I've had, it's more about starting with a blank page and then saying, well, rather than me deciding even the structure that we're working in, what would work for you. But some people go straight to the consultation after having formed the basis within which they're working, and that's already wrong. So and also you're talking about it very locally. So there was a comment somewhere where someone talked about individual service funds, a great mechanism for supporting this. And I know people also talk about having PAs, so personal assistants. So that's human relationship. You're very close. There's a lot of debate about how that the person is supported to effectively become an employer, but it's what you're saying about making it local. The problem that I often find is that those local, very personal relationships aren't often supported from head office, if you like, because you'll have a situation, you have to have a meeting, and people won't even think of engaging the person who it's about. And there's this hierarchy of opinion where if you're working closely with an individual, but then you're in a room with a consultant or someone with an academic or professional background, people tend to sway towards their point of view rather than the person who says, okay, I haven't been to university for this, but I do work every day with this person, and, you know, helping them to say what they think is right. If they can't voice it themselves, those voices are sometimes really struggle to get through. How do we solve that problem?
I mean,
Throw that out.
there is so there is something important about recognizing all of those voices in a system of care, because it's not like the consultant, the hospital, doesn't have a useful perspective on this. They do, and they will have developed that perspective through looking at tons of evidence accumulated over years and sort of they have a useful part to play in that conversation. But we have previously tended to devalue the knowledge and wisdom that comes from people's own experiences of their lives and their bodies and blah, 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 right? And part of my analysis to devalue that is because we have this false notion of a hierarchy of evidence, that randomized controlled trials, so the sort of things that get reported in medical papers and blah, 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 they're the best form of evidence. They're the things we should pay attention to most. And the voice of those in the world are those kind of consultants and blah, 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 blah. Whereas the lived experience of the people being served under that view of the world gets thought of as anecdotal. And that's not, we can kind of listen to it if there's nothing else, but it's not the most important thing. So that way of looking about what counts as evidence is a fundamentally anti-complex way of looking at the world. So you would never get a complexity scientist saying that an RCT is a better form of evidence than a story from the person's own life. So it's why the complexity grounding in this, and this is robust complexity science, this is hardcore, this is physicists, this is computational scientists, this blah, blah, they would never say that hierarchy of evidence is appropriate in a complex environment. So by understanding that the world is complex, we free ourselves from the prison of this hierarchy of evidence, and it enables us to hear a variety of perspectives that are important in working out what the best thing to do in this scenario is.
Sorry, I had to close the door because my children started to scream. What I was going to ask is, with this idea of complexity and talking about this hierarchy, I loved the fact that you called out how people talk about anecdotal evidence, because I find it really frustrating in that when you do research, not you, but generally when you're doing research, your research is on social sciences, anecdotal evidence, and then it only becomes research and evidence that people or so commissioners or whoever take notice of because an academic has sifted through it. So actually, and especially when we're in a situation now in COVID-19 where we have to respond really, really, really quickly, we sometimes can't wait for anecdotal evidence to become research. Like, that will come. We have to just act on what people say.
Indeed. So again, without wishing to bore on about complexity, except that's kind of my job, that perspective on what evidence is provably wrong for a complex environment. So as soon as we acknowledge that the world is complex, that idea that there is a hierarchy of evidence, where we can only take things from randomized controlled trials or the kind of equivalent, blah, 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 it's provably wrong. It is simply the wrong epistemological approach to take in a complex environment. So, and that then opens the door to exactly the kind of alternative ways of learning that you're talking about. And the move from thinking about people's own personal experience as kind of low-class anecdotes to treating that seriously as part of a learning environment, kind of robustness and rigor is still really important in this context. So we need to be able to, the whole thing about saying that it is the job of public managers to create an effective learning environment is to create a learning environment in which the different types of knowledge and data that we need to make effective decisions in our system on an ongoing basis, we have a way to bring that knowledge into the system for all the people who need to do a sense-making exercise to say, what does that mean? And for us to have a way to enact to put into practice the things that we learn. So that process of creating an ongoing learning environment is exactly what I mean when I say that is the job of public managers.
It's very different from how people have been trained and presumably
Yes.
are being trained today. If you want a career in public management, presumably it needs to start from when people enter the profession. Is there any move to look at the curriculum?
So yeah, actually, business schools need to hold their hand up here along with everyone else in terms of how we have educated managers previously. So I'm a secondment at the Centre for Public Impact from Newcastle Business School, and business schools in general need to do a mea culpa around this. We have trained managers to do the wrong thing, to set targets, to monitor performance, to blah, blah, blah. But there are now moves from a range of business schools, including Newcastle Business School, which is Northumbria University's business school, to develop alternative curricula for training public managers. So we've recently developed a master's in strategic public management that begins to address exactly some of these kind of questions.
Great. That's really promising, and that's good to see. And I mean, if you're working in public management and you are listening to this, or you're aware of what you're doing there and you think it's great, obviously, how do people get involved in finding out more or suggesting it to their manager that they maybe get in contact with you or what your team is doing?
So the place to start would be the new Human Learning Systems website. So that's it's our attempt to kind of gather together all that we know so far about this alternative way of working. Excellent timing with the banner there. Thanks very much. And on that, people can access all the kind of different local things, but they can also propose case studies. So if you're working in this way in any aspect, then there's a little form that you can say that tell us about your work, and we'll upload it. And there's a little map that we kind of put it so people can see all the different range of things. Right. And also there's a subscribe function so people can keep up to date with the latest information and blah, 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 blah.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah, and there's a if you want to get in touch form. So human learning systems.
Great. And in terms of when people get in touch, do you do a piece of work with people with organizations? If there's a local authority and they're like, we just want to deep dive into what we're doing and we want to change the whole commissioning. I'm not gonna say that anyone would want to do this, but say there's someone who's just like really woke and they're just like, okay, we want to do this. Would you go in and help them along that journey?
So there are the kind of human learning system stuff is a collaboration between lots of different organizations who are trying to make this stuff happen. And so as part of that collaborative, there are a range of organizations whose expertise it is in helping organizations to change in that way. So organizations like Collaborate, organizations like Empower, we can do bits of that at CPI, organizations like Easier Inc., there's a kind of whole partners list on there of people, organisations that might be able to help organisations who want to go on this kind of change journey.
And I think that it seems really so much more urgent and relevant now that we've got COVID-19 and we realize that actually nothing is going to go back to how it was, exactly how it was. I don't like to overplay that it's a whole new world, because you don't want to overestimate people's desire to go back to how things were because of the familiarity of that. But saying that this might be a time to think this could be more effective because we're being more personalized. We're looking at individuals. We're having to work together. I was speaking to people I would never have spoken to within my work before, because those systems never talk to each other. So this might be a time to kind of swat up, understand it, and see how it might be relevant going forward. So yeah. Really helpful. Thank you so much for coming on. And I know you're incredibly busy. So it's been really a real treat to have you on. I'm going to let you go. I'm going to give a few updates, and I will do a slightly different ending to what we normally do, because we've managed to upload a very accessible video that's been done about human learning systems. Which
is this our little animation?
Nice. It's your little animation. Is that quite new?
Yes, that's kind of a week old.
There we go. We're right on the pulse. So we'll play out with that. So do stick around for that, people. But for now, thank you so much, Toby, and take care.
Cheers, Sophie. It was a pleasure.
So that was Toby Lowe about human learning systems. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, the usual, do share it. I think there is a lot of lectures as well on YouTube. I would very much encourage people to go on, because he's very engaging speaker, and to share those lectures as well. Obviously, we've done a very relaxed conversation about human learning systems, but it goes into it in much more detail to share with colleagues. And then we've had details of their website. So do engage with that if you're in the, or even if you're not interested in public management. I just find it's a very different way of working and managing in general. So again, just to give another shout out to what we're coming back to tonight, and that's with Martin Green, Professor Martin Green from Care England, and Una Smith from Skills for Care. And we'll be doing a live stream with both of them. We've got so much to cover. I have no idea how we're going to fit it into 1 hour, but hopefully you'll take a lot away from it. I know there's loads of subjects, from everything from the new report that Public Health England released not long ago this week around the disparity of the figures around non-white groups and how COVID is affecting them. A lot of people were frustrated because it didn't quite go into recommendations, and they felt it should have. So that's definitely going to come up. We're going to talk about funding as well. There's a lot of restrictions on how people can get the £600 million that the government released for infection control, which is a fantastic headline for the government to talk about. But in reality, providers are finding out this week they're having to sign contracts in order to get access, and there are very strict guidelines that you have to adhere to in order to get access to that money, and it doesn't cover PPE. So amongst everything else, along with care homes and supported living and a whole heap of stuff. But that's the stuff that I've been following, and I think we should talk about. Maybe you've got some ideas. Let us know. #chat4care. What should we be asking Martin Green? What should we be asking Una Smith from Skills for Care? This may be your last chance for a long time. These are very extremely busy people, to find out their view on certain things and maybe raise issues that they might not be aware with. Martin Green works a lot with lobbying for social care. So he speaks, and his organization speaks with the Department of Health and Social Care. So he's a fantastic person to get your views to. Una Smith, of course, has also got a line into the Department of Health and Social Care, but she's also working with providers and within Skills for Care, and trying to get training and support around well-being and other things. So you might have some suggestions of what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what should be done next. And I think that's pretty much it, really. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Like I said, I'm going to play out with the animation, and hopefully we'll see you at 7 o'clock this evening. And if you can't make it, that's fine. Still subscribe, and you can watch it back later. Take care, everyone.